Burbank, Indiana, seemed like a place where time had stopped somewhere in the middle of the last century. Main Street stretched for only 8 blocks, and every morning at 6:30, Owen Harrison drove down it in his beat-up pickup truck on his way to the auto repair shop. On that October Monday, he waved to Mrs. Parker, who was watering flowers on her porch, and nodded to old Mr. Johnson, who was reading the newspaper on a bench near the post office. Owen Harrison was the kind of man everyone in Burbank knew. 42 years old, solidly built, with the calloused hands of a mechanic and kind brown eyes. 18 years ago, he had married Deborah Wilkins, the daughter of a local farmer, and since then, they had been considered one of the most stable couples in town. Every Sunday, they sat in the 3rd row of Holy Spirit Baptist Church, Owen in his only blue suit, Deborah in a modest dress she had sewn herself. Harrison's auto repair shop was located on the outskirts of town, in an old brick building that Owen had rented from the widow McDonald for 10 years. It smelled of motor oil and metal, and the walls were hung with calendars featuring classic cars and faded family photos. Owen could fix any car, from an old Ford to a modern Chevrolet, and never overcharged his neighbors, who came to him with problems that weren't always car-related. Deborah worked as a nurse at the only clinic in Burbank, a small medical center on Main Street. 39 years old, slim, with neatly styled blonde hair and attentive blue eyes. Patients loved her for her soft voice and her ability to calm even the most nervous child before a vaccination. Dr. Stevens, the elderly doctor who ran the clinic, often said that Deborah was the best nurse he had worked with in his 30 years of practice. In the evenings, the Harrisons dined at home in a small 2-story house on Oak Avenue, which they had bought 3 years after their wedding. The house was modest but cozy, a living room with a fireplace, a kitchen overlooking the backyard where Deborah grew tomatoes and roses, and 2 bedrooms upstairs. On the mantelpiece were photographs of their wedding, family celebrations, and trips to Lake Michigan. The only sad note in their marriage was the absence of children. Deborah had 2 miscarriages in the first 5 years of her marriage, and after that, they didn't try again. People in Burbank whispered about it sympathetically, but no one dared to ask direct questions. Instead of children, the Harrisons had a golden retriever named Buddy, who greeted Owen at the gate every evening and slept at the foot of his bed. The church played an important role in the couple's life. Owen had been a deacon for 6 years, helping Pastor Wilson organize services, repairing church equipment, and coordinating charity drives. Deborah sang in the church choir and led a women's group that met every Wednesday to study the Bible and discuss church matters. Their faith was simple and sincere, without fanaticism, but with a deep conviction that they had chosen the right path. Pastor James Wilson had led the community for 20 years. 55 years old, gray-haired, with a soulful voice and intelligent gray eyes behind gold-rimmed glasses. He knew every family in his congregation, baptized children, married young couples, and buried the elderly. Wilson enjoyed unquestionable authority in Burbank, and even those who rarely attended church listened to his opinion. Life in Burbank was measured and predictable. In the summer, there was the traditional corn festival, in the fall, the harvest festival, and in the winter, Christmas plays at the school. Crime was rare. Sometimes teenagers broke windows or someone drove drunk. Sheriff Thomas Brown, a fat man with a gray mustache, had not investigated a single serious crime in his 20 years of service. Alex Morgan entered this peaceful world in early September. She was 24 years old, tall, slender, with long dark hair and expressive green eyes. She rented a small apartment above Miller's Bakery and got a job as a waitress at the Pink Cafe, the only restaurant in Burbank, not counting the diner on the highway. Alex wasn't from around there, which made her the subject of curiosity. She said she had come from Chicago but avoided talking about her past in detail. She dressed simply but tastefully, was polite to customers, and did her job well. The cafe's owner, Mrs. Jenkins, was pleased with her choice of staff and praised the new waitress to her friends. But in conservative Burbank, people were used to knowing everything about each other, and Alex's mysteriousness gave rise to rumors. Some noticed that her hands were too large for a woman, while others drew attention to her low voice, which was especially noticeable in the mornings. Mrs. Parker, the local gossip, once remarked to a neighbor that, "There's something wrong with that girl," but she couldn't put her finger on it. Owen first saw Alex at the Pink Cafe on Saturday when he stopped in for coffee after work. She was behind the counter washing cups, and when she looked up, their eyes met. Alex smiled, a simple, friendly smile from a new employee greeting a regular customer. Owen nodded in response, ordered a coffee to go, and left, not thinking much of the encounter. Deborah heard about the new waitress from her colleagues at the clinic. Dr. Stevens mentioned that he had seen an unfamiliar girl at the cafe, and Nurse Betty Cole said that the new girl was very nice and made good coffee. Deborah decided to stop by and say hello. In a small town, it was important to know everyone, especially those who worked in the service industry. The meeting took place on Tuesday. Deborah ordered a salad and tea, and Alex served her quickly and professionally. They exchanged a few words about the weather and work. Alex seemed like a nice girl to Deborah, perhaps a little reserved, but that was understandable. Moving to a new city is always stressful. Pastor Wilson met Alex a week after she arrived. He had a habit of visiting local establishments, meeting new residents, and inviting them to church. Alex listened politely, thanked him for the invitation, but said she wasn't ready to attend church yet. Wilson didn't insist. Experience had taught him that coercion rarely leads to sincere faith. Life in Burbank continued as usual. Owen repaired cars, Deborah cared for the sick, and Pastor Wilson prepared his Sunday sermons. Alex worked at a cafe, gradually becoming part of the townscape. Nothing seemed to foreshadow the drama that would unfold in a few weeks and turn the lives of everyone involved upside down. In the last days of September, the weather began to change. The days grew shorter, and the leaves on the old oak trees along Main Street began to turn yellow. Owen, stopping by the cafe for his morning coffee, noticed Alex more and more often, how she carefully wiped the tables, how politely she spoke to the elderly customers, how sadly she looked out the window in her rare moments of free time. Something about her caught his attention, although he couldn't explain what it was. October brought the first frosts to Burbank, and changes that at first seemed insignificant. Owen began to visit the Pink Cafe more often than usual, not only for his morning coffee but also during his lunch break. He explained this to himself as convenience. The cafe was halfway between his workshop and home, and the sandwiches there were pretty good. But to be honest, he was drawn to the short conversations with Alex. She turned out to be a surprisingly good listener. When Owen complained about the temperamental engine of his old Buick or shared his plans to expand the workshop, Alex listened attentively and asked intelligent questions. It turned out that she knew a little about cars in Chicago. She had helped a friend repair cars. This surprised Owen. Most women in Burbank considered auto repair to be strictly a man's job. I had different hobbies. Alex smiled mysteriously when Owen asked her where she got her knowledge. She was generally reluctant to talk about her past, as if trying to forget something painful. Owen understood that feeling. Everyone has pages in their life that are better left unturned. Gradually, their conversations became more personal. Alex told him that she had no family. Her parents had died in a car accident 3 years ago, and she had no brothers or sisters. She had moved to Burbank because she wanted to start a new life in a quiet place, far from big cities and their problems. Owen sympathized. He couldn't imagine life without a family, without roots. "Are you happy in your marriage?" Alex asked unexpectedly one evening when the cafe was almost empty. The question caught Owen off guard. He paused, stirring sugar into his coffee. "Deborah is a good woman," he finally replied. "We understand each other." That was true, but it wasn't the whole truth. After 18 years of marriage, the passion was gone, leaving behind affection, habit, and shared interests. They lived like good neighbors, sharing a home and responsibilities. Alex nodded, not pressing for details. Something like understanding flashed in her eyes, and Owen thought that she too knew what it was like to be lonely in a relationship. Meanwhile, in Burbank, talk about Alex was growing. Mrs. Parker was convinced that something was wrong with that girl. She shared her suspicions with her neighbors over morning coffee in her living room, with lace curtains and photos of her grandchildren on the piano. "Look at her hands," Mrs. Parker said, lowering her voice. "They're too big, and her shoulders are broad. And her voice? In the morning, it sounds like a man's." Her listeners nodded, recalling their own observations. Mrs. Coleman noted that Alex never wore dresses, only jeans and shirts. Mrs. Davis pointed out her gait, which was too long for a woman. Rumors spread through the town like water through a broken dam. At the hairdressers, at the grocery store, at the bus stop, everywhere people whispered about the mysterious waitress. So far, it was just suspicion and speculation, but it poisoned the atmosphere and created an invisible wall of mistrust. At first, Deborah paid no attention to the gossip. She had enough of her own worries. A seasonal wave of colds had begun at the clinic. There were more patients, and there was more work to do. Dr. Stevens often stayed late on calls, and Deborah was effectively running the clinic in his absence. But gradually, she began to notice changes in her husband's behavior. Owen stayed late at work more often and came home later than usual. He answered questions distractedly, as if he were thinking about something else. At dinner, he was quieter than usual, staring pensively out the window. When Deborah asked him what was bothering him, he dismissed her with, "Just tired, honey." The first serious alarm bell rang on Wednesday evening. Deborah finished work earlier than usual and decided to stop by a cafe for a pie for dinner. Through the window, she saw Owen sitting at a corner table. He was talking to Alex, who was sitting on a chair opposite him. They were talking about something serious, leaning toward each other. Alex put her hand on Owen's shoulder, a gesture of comfort or support. Deborah froze on the sidewalk, feeling a chill rise from her stomach to her throat. She had never seen her husband in such an intimate conversation with another woman. Even with her, he had rarely spoken so confidentially in recent years. Alex said something, and Owen smiled, that warm smile Deborah remembered from the early years of their relationship. She turned and walked home without going into the cafe. All evening, she was tormented by questions, but she didn't dare ask her husband directly. At dinner, Owen talked about repairing Johnson's truck, and there was nothing unusual in his voice. Maybe she was just making up problems out of nothing. The next day, Deborah deliberately stopped by the cafe for lunch. Alex served her as usual, politely, professionally, without a hint of embarrassment. They exchanged a few words about the weather. Deborah studied the girl closely, trying to figure out what was so special about her. Alex was attractive, but not beautiful in the classic sense. She was tall, slender, with regular features, but there was something about her that seemed unusual. Pastor Wilson also began to notice changes in his congregation. At the last church council meeting, several parishioners expressed concern about the new resident. Deacon Martin, who owned the local grocery store, said bluntly, "Pastor, that girl is giving me pause. People are saying things." Wilson was cautious in his judgment. In his 20 years of ministry, he had learned to distinguish between legitimate concerns and prejudice. "What exactly is bothering you, Brother Martin?" he asked. "Well," Martin hesitated, "she's just not right. She acts strange. And besides, we don't know who she really is or where she came from." Other council members supported Martin. Mrs. Davis suggested tactfully finding out more about Alex's background. The church treasurer, Mr. Thompson, remarked that in this day and age, we have to be careful with strangers. Wilson listened to everyone and asked for time to think. He understood the parishioners' concerns, but didn't want to give in to prejudice. At the same time, his pastoral duty included protecting the community from possible threats. The problem was that no one could clearly articulate what the threat was. On Friday, Wilson decided to go to the cafe himself and talk to Alex again. She greeted him with the same polite smile she had given him a month ago. They talked for 15 minutes about life in Burbank, work, and plans for the future. Alex still avoided talking about her past in detail, but there was nothing criminal about that. Many people prefer not to stir up painful memories. "Do you know what people are saying about you?" the pastor finally asked bluntly. Alex paused, wiping imaginary dust from the counter. "I guess so," she replied quietly. "There are always gossip mongers in small towns. Maybe you should clear up their doubts? Tell them more about yourself? What if the truth is worse than their speculation?" Alex looked up at the pastor. There was so much pain in her eyes that Wilson felt a pang of sympathy. "God judges by the heart, not by the past," he said gently. "Not everyone shares your wisdom, Pastor." Wilson left the cafe even more puzzled. Alex was clearly hiding something important, but there was nothing malicious or dangerous in her words or behavior. On the contrary, he sensed a deep vulnerability in her, a desire for peace and acceptance. Meanwhile, the relationship between Owen and Alex continued to deepen. They saw each other almost every day, sometimes at the cafe, sometimes by chance on the street. Owen found himself looking forward to these encounters, thinking about them in the evenings. Alex became a source of understanding and support that he lacked at home. One rainy Thursday, when the cafe was almost empty, their conversation took an unexpected turn. Alex confessed that she had always felt out of place, as if she had been born in the wrong body. Owen didn't immediately understand what she was talking about, but gradually the meaning of her words dawned on him. "You mean?" He didn't finish his question. "I was born a man," Alex said simply, "but I never felt like one. 3 years ago I decided to transition. I moved here to start a new life." Owen was silent for a long time, digesting what he had heard. In his world in Burbank, such things were not discussed, hardly even acknowledged as possible. But looking at Alex, at her open, vulnerable face, he understood that this was not a sick fantasy or a perversion, but a deep inner need to be herself. "Why did you tell me?" he finally asked. "Because you're the first person here who sees me as just a person. And because," she paused, "because I think you also know what it's like to live a life that isn't what people expect of you." These words hit home. Owen really felt that his life was following someone else's script, the role of a model husband, a deacon, a pillar of society. But who was he really? When was the last time he had done something out of his own desire, not out of duty or habit? "What now?" he asked. "Now you know my secret," Alex smiled sadly, "and you can decide if you want to continue our relationship." Owen looked at her long and intently. Alex's transgender identity did not change how he felt about her. The warmth, understanding, and closeness that had been missing from his marriage for years. If anything had changed, it was only his respect for her courage. "I'm ready," he said firmly, "no matter what anyone else says." But the word others reminded him of reality. If the truth about Alex came out, the consequences would be catastrophic. For her, for him, for everyone connected to them. Burbank would not forgive such a revelation. November arrived in Burbank with cold rains and gray skies that mirrored the mood of its residents. The atmosphere in the city became tense, as if a storm were brewing. Rumors about Alex Morgan turned from whispers to open discussions, and suspicions became almost certainty. Owen felt the noose tightening around him. At the gas station, Jim Marshall, a friend from school, remarked meaningfully, "I hear you've been spending a lot of time at the cafe. Be careful with the new girl. People are saying strange things." At the auto shop, salesman Tom Wilkins, Deborah's cousin, asked bluntly, "Owen, is it true that Alex used to be a man?" Each conversation was like a stab in the heart. Owen knew that Alex's secret was hanging by a thread, and when it came out, and it would in such a small town, the consequences would be terrible. Alex would lose her job and be forced to leave. But worst of all, his own reputation, his family's reputation, his position in the church, everything would be destroyed. Deborah, meanwhile, was conducting her own investigation. She could no longer ignore the changes in her husband's behavior. Owen had become distracted, often withdrawn, answering questions with monosyllables. In the evenings, he would sit on the porch for long periods of time, staring into space even when it was cold. Sex between them, already rare, had practically ceased. On Wednesday evening, Deborah followed her husband. He said he was going to the workshop to finish an urgent order, but instead of the workshop, he headed for a park on the outskirts of town. There, on a bench by an old oak tree, Alex was waiting for him. Deborah hid behind some bushes and watched. They sat close together, talking quietly. Alex was crying. Deborah could see her wiping her eyes with her jacket sleeve. Owen put his arms around her shoulders and pulled her close. It wasn't a romantic embrace, more a gesture of comfort and support. But that didn't matter to Deborah. Her husband was comforting another woman, sharing with her what he should have shared only with his wife. Deborah returned home before Owen and went to bed, pretending to be asleep when he entered the bedroom. She lay awake all night, replaying what she had seen in her head. 18 years of marriage, 18 years of loyalty and devotion. Was it all coming to an end because of some stranger? At breakfast the next morning, she decided to have a frank conversation. "Owen, we need to talk," she said, placing a plate of scrambled eggs in front of him. He looked up from the newspaper. "About what, dear?" "About that girl. About Alex Morgan." Deborah sat down opposite her husband, folding her hands on the table. "I know you're seeing each other." Owen turned pale. "Deborah, it's not what you think." "What is it? Explain it to me." There was no hysteria or accusation in Deborah's voice, only fatigue and pain. Owen was silent for a long time, searching for the right words. How could he explain to his wife something he didn't fully understand himself? How could he describe a feeling of understanding and closeness that had nothing to do with cheating in the traditional sense? "She's lonely," he finally said. "She has no one in this city. I'm just there for her." "Support her?" Deborah smiled bitterly. "Who's supposed to support me? I'm your wife, Owen. I've been with you for 18 years and you share your feelings with a stranger." "Deborah, please try to understand." "Understand what? That my husband prefers the company of another woman? That the whole town is gossiping about us because of your meetings?" Owen stood up from the table. "I'm not betraying you, Deborah. What Alex and I have isn't a romance. It's..." "What is it?" his wife interrupted him. He couldn't find the words. How could he explain that Alex gave him something he had never had in his marriage? Understanding of his inner struggles, acceptance of his doubts and weaknesses. With Deborah, he always had to be strong, reliable, and right. With Alex, he could just be himself. "I'm thinking about divorce," Deborah said quietly. The words hit Owen like a bolt of lightning. Divorce? In their family, in their circle, divorce was almost unthinkable. It would mean shame, expulsion from the church community, the destruction of his entire life. "Deborah, don't make any rash decisions." "Hasty?" She stood up and walked over to the window. "I've been thinking about this for a month. I've been watching you drift away, watching you change. You're not my husband anymore, Owen. You're a stranger." They didn't speak again that day. Owen went to his workshop, Deborah to the clinic. Each immersed themselves in their work, trying to drown out the pain and confusion. Meanwhile, Pastor Wilson was preparing for the most difficult conversation of his career. The day before, Deacon Martin had come to him with a group of influential parishioners. They demanded that action be taken against Alex Morgan. The rumors had reached a critical point. Now no one doubted that the new waitress was not a real woman. "Pastor, we can't allow someone like that to live in our town," Martin said, nervously fingering his hat. "Think of our children, of the moral fabric of our community." Mrs. Davis, always reserved and pious, was particularly emphatic. "This is an abomination before the Lord. The Bible is clear about such things." Wilson listened to everyone and asked for time to think and pray. But he knew that time was running out. The pressure from the community was becoming unbearable, and if he didn't take action, his own position would be in jeopardy. On Thursday evening, the pastor came to Alex's home. She rented a small apartment above a bakery, 2 rooms with modest furnishings and a view of the main street. Alex greeted him without surprise, as if she had been expecting him. "I know why you're here," she said, offering him tea. "Alex, the situation is becoming critical," Wilson began. "People know the truth about you, or they think they do. And what do you suggest? That I leave town? That would be the easiest solution, for everyone." Alex was silent for a long time, looking out the window at the lit street. "You know, Pastor, I've spent my whole life running away from myself, from the truth, from people's prejudices. I thought it would be easier in a small town, among simple people. But it turns out that prejudice doesn't depend on the size of the town. People are afraid of what they don't understand," Wilson said gently. "Do you understand?" She turned to him. "Do you understand what it's like to be born in the wrong body? To live someone else's life? To feel like a stranger in your own skin?" Wilson answered honestly, "No, I don't understand. But I can see that you're suffering, and that makes me feel for you." "Sympathy isn't enough," Alex said bitterly. "I need acceptance, and I won't find that here." "You have Owen," the pastor said gently. Alex flinched. "What do you know about Owen?" I know he's your friend, and that because of that friendship, he has problems at home. I didn't want to ruin his marriage, Alex said quietly. Owen is a good man. He's the only one who has accepted me for who I am. But I understand that our friendship is costing him dearly. Wilson studied her face in the dim light of the room. There was nothing threatening or wicked about Alex. On the contrary, he saw a confused, lonely person searching for a place in the world. What if I talk to the community? He suggested unexpectedly. I'll explain to them that you're not a threat. Alex shook her head. It won't help. They've already made up their minds. And you know what? Maybe they're right. Maybe people like me really don't belong among normal people. Don't say that, Wilson said sharply. God created us all, and everyone has a right to happiness. Nice words, Pastor. But on Sunday, you'll be preaching about sin and repentance, not acceptance and love. Wilson couldn't think of a response because Alex was right. His church, his community, were not ready for such a challenge to traditional beliefs. The next day, Owen made a decision that changed everything. He could no longer live a double life, hiding his friendship with Alex, lying to his wife and to himself. That evening, he went to Pastor Wilson's house. "Pastor, I need to talk to you," he said, standing at the doorstep of Wilson's house in a dark coat in the rain. They went into the pastor's office, a small room with bookshelves, an old oak desk, and a crucifix on the wall. Owen couldn't start for a long time, pacing the room, nervously fingering his cap. "I know the truth about Alex Morgan," he finally said, "and I want to admit it publicly." "Owen, think about the consequences." "I've thought about it, Pastor. I've thought about it for months. Alex is a good person. She doesn't deserve what's happening to her. And I can't keep quiet when people are spreading rumors about her. But your family, your position in the church, what good is my position if I can't protect an innocent person?" Owen stopped in front of the pastor. "You yourself have said in your sermons that a Christian must protect the weak and the oppressed." Wilson knew Owen was right, but he also knew that such an admission would destroy the deacon's life and split the community. "Maybe there's another way. Talk to people privately, explain." "No, Pastor. I've made my decision. On Sunday, in front of the whole congregation, I'm going to tell the truth. That Alex is a transgender woman. That I'm friends with her and don't consider it a sin. That our congregation must accept her for who she is." "Owen, they'll crucify you." "Maybe, but at least I'll be able to sleep at night." Pastor Wilson was silent for a long time, realizing the magnitude of the impending disaster. Owen's confession would not only destroy his own life, but also split the community and damage the church's reputation. But at the same time, he couldn't help but admire the deacon's courage. "All right," he finally said. "If you've made up your mind, I'll give you a chance to speak. But please, think about it again. You have until Sunday." Owen nodded and walked off into the night. Wilson sat in his office for a long time, praying and thinking about what would happen in 2 days. He felt a storm coming that would change Burbank forever. Deborah, meanwhile, was preparing for her own decision. She didn't know about her husband's intentions, but she understood that their marriage was at an impasse. Owen was becoming increasingly distant, and her suspicions about his relationship with Alex were growing stronger every day. On Saturday evening, she sat in the kitchen, sorting through family photos. The wedding, the honeymoon, family holidays, their entire life together fit into one box. Had it all been for nothing? Owen walked into the kitchen and saw the photos. "Deborah," he said. "Don't say anything," she interrupted. "I understand. Tomorrow after church, we'll talk about the divorce." He wanted to say something, but changed his mind. Maybe divorce really was the best solution for both of them, especially considering what he was planning to do tomorrow. On Sunday morning, Burbank woke up to a gray sky that promised rain. No one suspected that this day would be a turning point in the history of the city, that the events that would take place at Holy Spirit Church would forever change the lives of all its residents. Sunday morning, November 15th, began with heavy gray skies and a cold wind blowing fallen leaves through the streets of Burbank. The Harrisons' house was filled with an oppressive silence. Deborah and Owen prepared for church in silence, each lost in their thoughts about the day ahead. Deborah put on her best blue dress and pearl earrings, a gift from Owen for their 5th wedding anniversary. Standing in front of the mirror in her bedroom, she studied her reflection. 39 years old, the first wrinkles around her eyes, gray strands in her hair. She had been Owen Harrison's wife for 18 years, and today that life was supposed to end. After the service, she would demand an honest conversation about divorce. Owen was shaving in the bathroom with trembling hands. Every movement of the razor was difficult. His nerves were stretched to the limit. Today, he would do what he hadn't had the courage to do for months. He would tell her the truth about his friendship with Alex, protect her from lies and prejudice. He tried not to think about what would happen next. At breakfast, they exchanged only a few words about the weather. Deborah noticed that her husband's hands were shaking when he picked up his coffee cup. "Are you sick?" she asked. "Just nervous," Owen replied honestly. If only she knew how much. At 9:30, they got into the car and drove to church. The trip usually took 5 minutes, but today every second seemed like an eternity. Deborah looked out the window at the familiar houses, thinking that she might be seeing them for the last time as the wife of a respected deacon. St. Spirit Church stood in the center of Burbank, a white wooden building with a tall steeple and stained glass windows. Built in 1923, it was the heart of the local community, a place where all the important events in the lives of the townspeople were celebrated. Today, the church was to be the scene of tragedy. The Harrisons arrived at the church at 9:45 as usual. Owen, being a deacon, was supposed to help the pastor prepare for the service. Deborah walked into the hall and sat down in their usual place in the 3rd row. Parishioners were gathering around. About 100 people, practically the entire adult population of Burbank. The atmosphere in the church was unusually tense. People whispered to each other and exchanged meaningful glances. Everyone knew about the rumors surrounding Alex Morgan, and many guessed about the deacon's friendship with the new resident. They were waiting for the outcome. Mrs. Parker, sitting in the 2nd row, turned to her neighbor. "I heard that Owen Harrison is going to make an announcement today. Tom Wilkins said he saw him at the pastor's house yesterday." Deacon Martin, usually friendly, nodded coldly to Deborah. She realized that rumors about problems in their family had also leaked into the community. In a small town, it was impossible to hide family troubles. In the vestry, Pastor Wilson was putting on his vestments. His hands were shaking too, but not from excitement, but from a sense of impending disaster. He had prayed all night, trying to find a way to prevent the coming storm, but nothing came to mind. Owen was adamant in his decision. "Pastor, are you ready?" Owen peeked into the altar room. He was pale but determined. "Owen, it's not too late to change your mind," Wilson said quietly. "Think about Deborah, about your future." "I've been thinking all night, Pastor. My mind is made up." Wilson nodded. He knew there was no point in arguing further. "All right, I'll give you the floor after the sermon before the closing prayer." At 10 o'clock, the service began. Pastor Wilson stepped up to the pulpit, and Owen took his place next to the altar. Deborah sang the psalms with the choir, but her thoughts were far away. She thought about the conversation she was about to have with her husband, about how she would explain the reasons for the divorce to her relatives and friends. The pastor's sermon was on the theme of forgiveness and understanding. "Brothers and sisters," he said from the pulpit, "we live in a world full of temptations and delusions, but our duty as Christians is to bring the light of love even to the darkest corners of the human soul." Many parishioners felt that the sermon was addressed to a specific situation, but did not understand exactly which one. The sermon was to be followed by announcements and a closing prayer, but Pastor Wilson said, "Today, our deacon, Owen Harrison, would like to address the congregation with an important message." Owen slowly rose from his seat. The hall fell completely silent. Deborah felt her heart beat faster. Something in her husband's behavior told her that something significant was about to happen. Owen walked to the pulpit, placed his hands on its edges, and glanced around at those gathered. Familiar faces, people he had known all his life, who trusted and respected him. In a few minutes, that trust and respect would be gone forever. "Brothers and sisters," he began, his voice trembling with emotion. "Today I want to talk to you about Christian love and acceptance." Deborah tensed. Something in her husband's tone made her wary. "A month ago, a new resident arrived in our town. Alex Morgan. Many of you know her as a waitress at the Pink Cafe. She is a good, hard-working girl who has never hurt anyone. A murmur ran through the hall. People looked at each other, sensing something was wrong. But I know there are rumors about her, Owen continued, his voice growing firmer. Unfair rumors. And today I want to tell you the truth. Deborah grabbed the back of the bench. What was he going to do? Alex Morgan is a transgender woman, Owen said clearly. She was born in a male body, but she has always felt like a woman. 3 years ago, she found the courage to live in accordance with her true nature. An explosion of outrage shook the church. People jumped up from their seats, shouting and talking over each other. "Abomination!" Deacon Martin cried. "How dare he!" Mrs. Davis exclaimed indignantly. Pastor Wilson tried to restore order, but his voice was drowned out by the general din. Deborah sat frozen, unable to believe what she had heard. Her husband, a deacon of the church, was publicly defending whom? A pervert? A sinner? A man who was deceiving nature itself? I know many of you are shocked. Owen raised his voice, trying to be heard above the noise. But hear me out! Enough! Shouted Mr. Thompson, the church treasurer. We will not listen to this blasphemy. Alex is my friend, Owen continued, ignoring the shouts. Yes, I am friends with her. I see her, talk to her, support her. Because she's lonely, because she needs understanding, because it's my Christian duty. Christian duty? Pastor Martin rose from his seat. Your duty is to serve God, not the devil. Deborah slowly rose from the pew. The world around her swayed. Her husband's words sounded like a fog. A transgender woman. Who is her husband friends with? A man who pretends to be a woman? A pervert who has deceived the whole town? I urge you to show mercy. Owen did not give up. Christ taught us to love our neighbors, not to judge, to accept the outcasts. Alex didn't choose her fate, but she chose honesty. Enough! Deborah screamed so loudly that her voice drowned out all the others. She walked toward the altar, her eyes burning with rage and pain. Enough of these lies! Owen turned to his wife. In her face, he saw something he had never seen in 18 years of marriage. Hatred. Pure, unadulterated hatred. Deborah, please listen. Listen? She stopped a few steps away from the pulpit. Listen to my husband justify his relationship with that woman. It's not a relationship in the way you think. Don't lie to me! Deborah screamed, tears streaming down her cheeks. I've been a faithful wife to you for 18 years. 18 years I served this church, this community, and you betrayed everything we believed in. The entire church fell silent. Even the most indignant parishioners quieted down, watching the family drama unfold at the altar. Deborah, I haven't betrayed you. Owen stepped down from the pulpit and reached out to his wife. What's between me and Alex? What's between you and that pervert? Deborah's voice was full of venom. What could there be between a normal man and that thing? Friendship, understanding, what you and I haven't had in years. Those words hit Deborah like a slap in the face. So he openly admitted that a stranger gave him what his lawful wife couldn't? You destroyed our family, she said quietly, wiping away her tears. You disgraced me in front of the whole town. You betrayed your faith, your duty, your vows. Deborah, I'm trying to do the right thing. The right thing? She shouted again. Is it right to be friends with someone who mocks God's creation? Who turns a man into a woman and a woman into a man? Owen tried to take his wife's hands, but she pulled away. You don't understand, Alex, you don't. I understand more than you think. Deborah's voice took on a steely tone. I understand that my husband has traded me for a pervert. I understand that our marriage is a lie. I understand that you never truly loved me. That's not true. It's true. Deborah turned toward the altar where the church trappings stood. Her gaze fell on a massive brass candlestick, a family heirloom donated to the church by her grandfather. It was heavy, old, with sharp edges. What happened next took only a few seconds. Deborah grabbed the candlestick with both hands. The heavy brass was cold to her palms, but inside she was burning with rage, pain, and a sense of betrayal. Deborah, what are you doing? Owen stepped toward her, reaching out his hands. She looked at her husband, the man she had loved for 18 years, the man she had married in a white dress right here in this church, the man she had dreamed of growing old with. But this was no longer the Owen she knew. This was a stranger who had betrayed everything sacred between them. "You killed our love," she said quietly. "You killed our family. You killed my life." And she raised the candlestick above her head. "Deborah, no!" Pastor Wilson shouted. But it was too late. The candlestick crashed down on Owen's head with a dull thud that would forever echo in the memories of everyone present. Owen fell to his knees, then to the floor, blood flowing down the steps of the altar. Deborah stood over her husband's body, still clutching the bloody candlestick. Her face was calm, almost peaceful. The shock of what she had done had not yet registered. The church erupted in screams of horror. Women screamed. Men rushed to the altar. Pastor Wilson fell to his knees next to Owen, trying to feel for a pulse. But it was clear that there was no hope. The blow had struck the base of the skull. "Call an ambulance! The police!" someone shouted. Deborah slowly lowered the candlestick to the floor. She stared at her husband's sprawled body without emotion, as if she were looking at a stranger. "He killed our love," she repeated quietly. "Now we're even." Deacon Martin approached her cautiously. "Deborah, step away from him." She looked up at him with empty eyes. 18 years, Charles. 18 years I was a good wife, and he traded me for a pervert. "Deborah, you need to sit down," Pastor Wilson said gently, getting up from his knees. "You're in shock." "No," she shook her head. "This is the first time I've been able to think clearly in months. He made his choice. Now I've made mine." 10 minutes later, Sheriff Brown and 2 of his deputies burst into the church. An ambulance followed, but there was nothing the medics could do. Owen Harrison was dead. Deborah was arrested right at the altar, offering no resistance. As the sheriff handcuffed her, she asked, "What about the one with Alex?" "What does that matter?" Brown asked in surprise. "Nothing," Deborah smiled sadly. "Nothing now." When the police took Deborah away and the medics took Owen's body, only Pastor Wilson and a few parishioners remained in the church. The blood on the altar steps slowly darkened, mixing with the morning light streaming through the stained glass windows. "Lord," whispered the pastor, "what have we done?" But there was no answer. Only the silence of the empty church and the echo of the tragedy that had forever changed Burbank. Detective Sarah Collins arrived in Burbank an hour after the murder. 48 years old, she was a short woman with piercing gray eyes and graying hair pulled back in a strict bun. In her 15 years with the state police, she had investigated dozens of murders, but she had never seen anything like this before. The Holy Spirit Church was cordoned off with yellow tape. Inside, a medical examiner photographed the crime scene while technicians collected evidence. The blood on the altar steps had already dried, turning into dark brown stains on the white marble. "What do we have?" Collins asked Sheriff Brown. "Murder in front of witnesses." Brown wiped the sweat from his forehead. "About 100 people saw Deborah Harrison kill her husband with a church candlestick. The motive seems to be related to some kind of family drama." Collins examined the altar and studied the murder weapon, a massive brass candlestick weighing about 3 kilograms. The blow had been delivered with great force, striking the base of the skull. It was a fatal blow. "Where's the suspect?" "At the station. She's acting strangely. Very calm, almost indifferent. She's refused a lawyer and says she'll confess to everything." Deborah's first interview took place that same evening. She sat in a small interrogation room, still wearing her blue church dress, now splattered with her husband's blood. Her face was pale but calm. "Mrs. Harrison, tell me what happened at the church today," Collins began, gently. "I killed my husband," Deborah replied simply. "I hit him over the head with a candlestick." "Why?" Deborah was silent for a long time, staring at the wall. "He betrayed me. He betrayed our family, our faith. 18 years of marriage, and it turns out I meant nothing to him." "Are you referring to his relationship with Alex Morgan?" "Relationship?" Deborah smiled bitterly. "He called it friendship. But I saw how he looked at her, how he talked to her. Things we hadn't had in years. Did you know Alex was transgender? I found out today, along with everyone else." Deborah's voice grew harsher. "Can you imagine? My husband, a deacon in the church, is friends with a pervert, and he has the nerve to justify it with Christian love." Collins studied the woman's face. There was no remorse, only pain and rage that had not yet cooled. "Mrs. Harrison, do you understand that you have committed murder?" "I do." Deborah looked the detective in the eye for the first time. "And I don't regret it. He killed our love long before today. I just settled the score." The next day, Collins began interviewing witnesses. The testimony was unanimous. Deborah Harrison had killed her husband in a fit of rage after his public confession, but the detective wanted to understand the full picture of what had happened. Pastor Wilson welcomed her into his office. He had aged overnight, his gray hair turning completely white and his eyes red from sleeplessness. "Pastor, tell me about the Harrisons. Did they have any problems?" "They seemed like a model couple," Wilson said slowly. "Owen was one of my best deacons, and Deborah was an active member of the community. But in recent months, I've noticed tension between them." "Related to Alex Morgan?" "Possibly. Owen became distant, and the day before the tragedy, he came to me wanting to publicly defend the girl. How did you feel about his decision?" Wilson paused. "I tried to talk him out of it. I knew the consequences would be disastrous. But Owen was adamant. He believed he was doing the right thing." "What can you tell me about Alex Morgan?" "She was a quiet, withdrawn girl. She didn't bother anyone and was a good worker. But people are afraid of what they don't understand." Collins found Alex in her apartment above the bakery. The girl was sitting by the window, staring at the empty street. She had lost even more weight overnight, her eyes red from crying. "Miss Morgan, I need to ask you a few questions." Alex nodded without turning around. "I know why you're here. Owen is dead because of me. It's not your fault." "No?" Alex turned to the detective. "If I hadn't come to this town, if I hadn't told him the truth about myself, he'd be alive. Tell me about your relationship with Mr. Harrison." "We were friends. Just friends." Alex's voice sounded pained. "He was the only one here who accepted me for who I am. He didn't judge me or condemn me. He just understood." "Did you know about the problems in his marriage?" "I had my suspicions. He never spoke ill of his wife, but I could sense that he was lonely, just like me." "What are you going to do now?" Alex turned back to the window. "I'm leaving. Today. This town will bury me with Owen if I stay." That evening, Collins was writing her report at a motel on the outskirts of town. The crime scene was clear. A wife had killed her husband in a fit of rage after he publicly admitted to being friends with a transgender woman. The motive was jealousy, a feeling of betrayal, and the collapse of her ideas about family life. But the detective understood that behind this simple explanation lay a more complex story about the clash of different worldviews, about the price of honesty in a conservative society, about the tragedy of people who were unable to understand each other. The next morning, Deborah was questioned again. She looked even calmer, as if she had made a final decision about her fate. "Mrs. Harrison, the psychiatrist believes that at the time of the murder, you were in a state of temporary insanity." "Insanity?" Deborah shook her head. "No, detective. I was perfectly sane. I just reached my limit." "Tell me more about that day. How did you feel?" Deborah closed her eyes, remembering. "When he started talking about this Alex, I didn't understand at first. Then, when I realized he was defending a transgender person, I felt like the ground was falling out from under me." "And what hurt you the most?" "That he chose her over me. For 18 years I was a faithful wife, supporting him in everything, and he found understanding in a stranger, in someone who isn't even a normal woman." Collins listened intently. "Do you regret what you did?" "That he's dead? Yes." "That our marriage is ruined?" "Yes." Deborah opened her eyes. "But that I defended my dignity?" Number 150. "Do you understand that you are facing a long prison sentence?" "I do. But at least I won't be living a lie anymore." A week later, Alex left Burbank. No one came to see her off, only Pastor Wilson waved silently from the window of his office. She boarded a bus to Chicago with a single suitcase and a one-way ticket. The wounds in the town began to heal gradually. The Pink Cafe closed. Mrs. Jenkins couldn't find new staff. The church resumed services 2 weeks later, but half of the congregation stopped attending. The memories were too painful. Pastor Wilson requested a transfer to another parish. In his last sermon, He spoke of forgiveness and understanding, but his words rang hollow in the half-empty hall. Deborah's trial took place 3 months later. Her lawyer insisted on manslaughter, while the prosecutor demanded a second-degree murder conviction. Deborah conducted herself with dignity, answering all questions honestly without trying to justify herself. When the sentence was read, 12 years in prison, she stood straight, unflinching. Few Burbank residents were present in the courtroom. Most preferred to forget the story. Detective Collins was in the courtroom when the sentence was handed down. After the hearing, she approached Deborah. "Is there anything you'd like to add?" Deborah looked out the courtroom window at the rooftops of Burbank. "You know, Detective, I've done what was expected of me my whole life. I was a good daughter, a good wife, a good Christian. And what did that get me?" "What?" "A husband who found understanding in another man, a life built on lies and pretense." Deborah turned to the detective. "Maybe Owen was right. Maybe honesty really is more important than public opinion. But I realized that too late." A year after the tragedy, Detective Collins was driving through Burbank again on business. The town looked quieter and sadder. The Pink Cafe had been turned into an office supply store, and a new pastor, a young man from a seminary, was serving at the church. The Harrisons' house was sold to a family from a neighboring county. The new residents knew nothing about the tragedy that had unfolded within these walls. Owen's auto repair shop had closed. No one wanted to continue the murdered mechanic's business. Fresh flowers lay on Owen Harrison's grave in the cemetery. Collins wondered who could have brought them. The caretaker explained that every week a woman from a neighboring town came, left a bouquet, and left without saying a word. "What does she look like?" asked the detective. "Tall, dark-haired, always in mourning clothes. They say she's the girl who started it all." Collins stood at the grave for a long time, thinking about the price of honesty and betrayal, about love and misunderstanding, about how one careless word could ruin people's lives. The inscription on the gravestone was simple: Owen Harrison, loving husband and devoted friend. The detective didn't know who had added the words about his friend, but she had her guesses. Deborah was serving her sentence in a maximum security women's prison 100 miles from Burbank. She worked in the prison library, behaved herself, and didn't get into any conflicts with anyone. The other inmates were surprised by her calmness. Usually, spousal murderers either became depressed or aggressively denied their guilt. Deborah did neither. She accepted her fate as just retribution for years of self-deception and hypocrisy. In letters to her relatives, she wrote that for the first time in many years, she felt honest with herself. Alex Morgan disappeared into the big city. Detective Collins managed to find out that she had gotten a job in social services, helping people like her adapt to their new lives. She never married or had children. She lived quietly and inconspicuously, just as she wanted in Burbank. But every week she visited the grave of the only person who had accepted her for who she was. The story of Burbank became a warning to other small towns. But few learned the lesson. People were still afraid of what they didn't understand, judged by appearances rather than actions, and chose convenient lies over painful truths.